Okay, we are going to do your collar band. Your collar is prepared, and now we're going to do the band and attach it to the shirt. We are going to use many of the same techniques that we used with your cuff, and so some of this will be just a little bit familiar to you. Just like I did for the cuff, I have my collar that is actually a print fabric, my collar band that is a print fabric, and my collar band facing that is a plain, so that you'll be able to keep track of which one is which throughout the video. If you look at your guide sheet, the very first thing it tells you to do is attach your interfacing to your collar band, to the wrong side. And so I have done that. Again, it is directional, but yeah, and you will start from the center and you will baste directionally out to the ends, and you will start from the center and you will baste directionally out to the end and get your interfacing based to your collar band at 1/4 inch. And then it tells you, after you've got the interbasting on, if you look at your guide sheet, it tells you now that you're going to attach your prepared collar to the collar band. And so I'm going to turn my collar band over so that I have the right side of my collar band up, and I'm going to bring my prepared collar that just came off my ham so that it is curled around, the edges folded under, it's been basted, it is completely ready to go, and you are going to pin the collar right side up, so you're looking at the right side of your collar and the right side of your collar band. Now remember, we basted this edge because when I lay this out flat now to pin it, I'm going to get a little bit of a bubble there. You want that tiny bit of a bubble so that as it folds out of the collar band and curls, it now lays smooth. You're allowing for that turn of cloth. And so you will take that collar band, and it's very important that you're looking at the right side of your collar band and the right side of your collar. If you don't, your collar will flip up the wrong direction. Remember, we prepared that collar so that it would lay and roll towards the shirt. If you get it the wrong direction, instead of these tips rolling towards the shirt, they will flip up and you will kind of look like the Pretty Little Dutch Girl type of thing. So you're going to pin those together, and you'll notice your collar edge bevels. You want that to happen. You should have marked with a little tiny clip right where that collar is supposed to come, so that you get it and your shirt and your collar meets at the front, and you have the same extension on both sides. So get that pinned into place, and then before you sew it, actually pick this up and fold it, align your collar along that front edge, fold the collar band over, and make sure that they do exactly align, that you really are symmetrical, that you don't have it offset. So those do line up and that they match. If they don't line up and match, repin that so that they do, because it will look really funny if your collar starts here on one side and starts back here on another. So be sure that you are aligned and that they match. When you're happy with that, then if you look at your guide sheet, it's going to tell you to attach that collar to the collar band. So we're going to head to the sewing machine and do that. Okay, so to attach this, we are going to baste it, and I'm going to baste it at 5/8 inch, but I want that seam allowance to wind up, my basting to wind up just inside my seam allowance. So I'm actually going to bump my needle one bump towards the right, so it winds up just barely inside my seam allowance, and then I'm just going to simply baste my collar to the collar band. And remember, you are going to have just a little bit of bubble out here to the side. It's allowing for that turn of cloth. When the collar itself is completed and turns outside the collar band. And you can see I've got my basted edge here where when I took the collar off the ham and put that in the machine and basted it so that that bevel, that offset would stay in place and I wouldn't lose that as I sew the collar to the collar band. Okay, after it's basted in place, do the same thing. I want you to fold it back in half. I want you to line up your collar tips, line up your collar band and make sure it is still symmetrical, that it hasn't slipped, and that it lays smooth and lays even, and that the whole thing lines up. If it has slipped, then unpick it and get it so that it lies the way that you want it to when the time comes. All right, now you are ready to attach the collar band facing to the collar. Okay, so we have our collar band and our collar attached to each other, and I got my collar band facing here. I am now going to take the collar band and attach it to the collar band facing. This becomes a sandwich seam. I am going to take my collar and attach it to my collar band right sides together, but my collar itself is sandwiched in between the two. And just like your cuff had to go around your wrist so that we had to pull out that edge to allow for that turn of cloth, the collar has to go around your neck. And so as you pin this, you are going to align the top and the bottom edge of your collar band, but that front edge needs to be extended out that 1/8 of an inch and possibly even just a little bit more. Because the collar band itself is so much longer than the cuff was, and it's not on a straight grain, there's on a little bit of bias here, a little bit of a curve, your fabric may give enough more that you have to actually pull that out a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. And so you're going to pin one end, then pin the other with that extension on the front towards those center front edges. The top of the collar band and the bottom of the collar band aligning. Center back, you should have a clip, and center back, align those clips because you want center back to meet at center back. Then you will have a little bit of extra fabric here that you have to, oops, I missed the piece there. You'll have that little bit of extra that you are then going to pull and stretch again to fit into that space so that it takes that collar and makes it roll around the person's neck, that it lays as smoothly as it pulls around. Again, you can take advantage of your cork top, pin it in place. You can work with the buddy and have somebody pull it for you, or you can just kind of go in sections and hand pull it yourself. But you want to make certain that you pull and stretch that collar band to fit now the collar band facing that has been pulled out so that this will turn and roll around the neck. And so if you watch, I am pulling this between the two and then grabbing with my thumb and finger where the pin's going to go. That allows me to do this by myself without a person pulling on it. It takes a little bit more time and to do it that way, but you can do it alone if you don't have somebody to hang on to that and give that pull for you, to pull that edge out for you. So you get one side ready to go, and if you look at it, it is going to tend to want to curl or roll just a little bit. That is what you want. You want it to tend to want to roll around that person's neck. So again, I'm going to pick it up, give it a pull, grab it, and stick a pin in where I've grabbed it, where I know that it laid smoothly, and pulled that edge around. If you look at your guide sheet, it is going to tell you, just like it did for the cuff, on your collar band facing side, it's going to tell you to actually fold that up at 5/8 of an inch and stitch that down in place. We are going to do the same thing on the collar band that we did on the cuff. We are going to leave that edge turned down and terminate that seam at 5/8 of an inch, exactly like you did with your cuff. So we're going to leave this piece floating free so that we can enclose that corner again. So up till now, the steps have been very, very similar to your cuff. That edge that has been pulled out to favor, you can do the same thing we did before as well. If it helps you to trim that down so that your collar band facing seam allowance matches your collar band seam allowance, you can certainly do that. And for lots of people, it's easier to trim it than to change the seam allowance from a 5/8 to 6/8 or a little bit more, depending upon the stretch of your fabric. And so you can just trim that extra out and line those up. Okay, so now it's ready to go. We are going to stitch this starting again with a terminated seam. So when I drop the needle in, I'm going to drop it 5/8 of an inch from the neckline edge and 5/8 of an inch from that front edge. So I'm going to drop my foot in and my needle in about right there to start to sew and to sew around that edge. So now we'll go to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to come to the sewing machine. This is my neckline edge. I'm just hand wheeling down, putting my needle down at 5/8 of an inch, the front, and I'm going to turn it the direction I'm actually going to sew it. And get that 5/8 of an inch away and make sure that I sit at 5/8 of an inch. And then drop my needle down. Back stitch. I'm going to shorten my stitch length just a tiny bit below that 2.4, just down to a 2 as I head around that corner. The only reason for that is, again, just like the curve of your cuff, if your stitch length is just a little tiny bit shorter on a curve, you quite often get a better looking curve. And as soon as I'm now to my straight edge, I'm going to go back to a true regulation stitch. And my stitching should be right next to that basting. I want my basting to barely be inside my seam allowance so that it doesn't show. And you can see, just if you look at the foot, my basting is barely past that groove. You can watch that, or you can actually watch your needle going up and down behind it. You can follow that edge at 5/8 of an inch because I haven't bumped the needle the one bump. I can sew at 5/8 and it will just stay right there aligned. Where it belongs. And you are going to sew the entire length of the collar band. Just exactly like your guide sheet tells you to, with the one exception of we are not folding up that collar band facing seam allowance and stitching into place. We are terminating the seam at 5/8 of an inch, just like you terminated the seam on your cuff. Okay, as I get towards this curve again, I'm going to come back and just shorten my stitch length just a little bit, just down to a 2 instead of a 2.4. My fabric is a little bit lightweight, and so I don't want to give it the chance to look like it is stop signing on that curve. And I'm going to sew down and terminate the seam at 5/8 of an inch. If you look, again, remember there is that line across the front of your machine that says you're now 5/8 of an inch from that front edge. I can back stitch there. Stitch back to that point. And you have both curved edges there. Okay. So you are going to now, just as a precursory, pull it out and look at it before you trim and grade. Granted, your curves aren't going to look great, but I want you to check a couple of things. I want you to check, are your collar tips the same length? If they're not, when you line them up, if one is offset, you need to unpick one side and pull that collar out or push it in so that it comes out of the collar band and your actual collar tips are the same length. Then kind of compare those curves against each other. Do we come out and line up the same? Are we going to be symmetrical with those two fronts? If it looks good, then we are ready to trim and grade. And if you look at your directions on your guide sheet, it's going to tell you your next step is to trim and grade. So we're going to go do some trimming and grading. So I'm ready to trim and grade. The collar band itself is trimmed to 3/8 of an inch. You should be able to just trim right along the basting line for your interfacing, and that should leave 3/8 of an inch. As you come around that collar band. As soon as you get around the curve, you'll remember that your collar is inserted in there. So you're going to trim just the collar band itself to 3/8 of an inch. I'll trim partway across here so you can see everything that's going to happen. And that would continue around all the way. Then you will come back and you will trim your interfacing to 1/8 of an inch. And again, the easiest way to do that, pull the interfacing away from everything else. If you'll just lay your scissors kind of tipped on their side there and lay them right against the stitching line, it will trim your interfacing to that 1/8 of an inch. And so you will trim that all the way around to the 1/8 of an inch. So the collar band's trimmed, the collar band interfacing is trimmed, the collar that was sandwiched in between needs to be 5/16 or just a 1/16 of an inch narrower than the collar band was. And so you'll come back and you will trim your collar itself just that little tiny bit narrower. Basically, you will cut that seam right in half. And so you can look and see that it's just slightly smaller than the collar itself was. And then the collar band facing is going to get trimmed down to 1/4 of an inch. So I'll clip into there and come around so you can see. And by trimming each layer to a different length, it is reducing the bulk gradually so there's not a little ledge when it's through. And so as you look at that, you can see there's my collar band, slightly smaller. The collar itself is a little bit longer and the collar band facing a little bit longer. They just get progressively a teeny tiny bit longer than each other. And you will continue that process, the trimming and the grading, along the entire length of that collar band. Okay? Then when that is done, you will come back now. This is a curve. We want that curve to lay smooth, and the only way to do that is to reduce the bulk. And so you'll come back with pinking shears and pink the edge of the collar band facing end of the collar band. Pink them separately so that those little triangle cuts don't necessarily hit the seam allowance exactly in the right place, so that you don't have a weak spot in your seam that then tends to want to stop sign a little bit or get sharp points on it. Okay, so you'll have both of those pinks separate from each other, and you can look at them and see they don't quite line up. They are off just a little bit. That's exactly what you're after. So I'm going to finish trimming and grading this, and then we'll get back together again. All right, so when the collar band is completely trimmed and graded, you can see the collar band facing. There's the collar band behind it, all of them just kind of beveling and getting slightly longer. We're going to turn this now right side out. And again, you can use the back side of that point presser or point turner to give yourself a smooth curve on that curved edge so that you don't wind up with stop signs. But quite often that will help just a little bit to get that curve pulled out smoothly. And then we're going to press the seam. Remember, you're going to press it flat as it was sewn, so just take your iron. Be sure the iron stays in the seam allowance. We are pressing that seam flat as it was sewn. So we're just going to press it flat as it was sewn. Then, again, because this was designed to be curved, I'm going to press my seam allowances towards that collar band because I want to have a very crisp, defined edge here. And so I'm going to take and pull that collar band down and press my seam allowance down towards Now, because I want that edge to be defined on both sides, I'm actually going to flip this over and do the same thing on the back side with the collar band facing. I want to press it down from both sides. When you are looking at the right side of your fabric, your collar band, you'll notice that this collar is laying here. Notice that tip curls up. That's what you want, because when all is said and done and that folds back, then the tip of my collar is going to roll towards my shirt. And so when you lay this out over this ham to press it, you say, whoa, that thing tips up. You hope it does tip up. Kind of give a little bit of a tug there, and some press and steam again, just defining that edge. And if you will pull both the collar band and the collar band facing, reach up in there and tug it. When you flip over and go from the back side, you can go very, very quickly, because on the back side, you either want to be in a flat surface, or if you do it over the ham like I did before, you've got to go just in teeny little sections because the curve is the wrong direction. We have favored this to roll around the neck, and so it wants to roll like it is now. And so if I reach up and pull, I can get that collar band facing pulled out and pretty well defined. And I get to this front edge again, I've got that same thing happening. I've got that collar flipping and rolling up exactly like what I want to have happening there. So I've done that. I'm just going to turn and look at this side. I can move the ham out of the way if I choose to, so I don't mess it up, and just give just a quick little press on that seam to make sure that that top edge, the seam is defined really well on both sides. After you've done pressing, roll that collar, look at it, make sure the front edges, your collar band facing, should be slightly favored. You should be seeing just a little tiny bit of that seam on the inside edge. You don't want to see any of your collar band facing on the outside edge. Check both of those, make sure it's good. If it is, we are now ready to attach our collar to our shirt. When you attach your collar to your shirt, you are attaching an inside curve to an outside curve, very much like the Princess Seam sample that you did, only it's a little bit slighter curve. If you look at that curved edge of your collar band, it's an outside curve, your neckline is an inside curve. So you are going to attach the collar band to your shirt, aligning center back, aligning your notches, lining up the front. The only way this will work, remember, is if you have clipped your inside curve first. And so clear back at the very beginning, first step, I stay stitched my neckline, so it's all stay stitched. And now I have clipped that neckline edge so that my neck can actually move and open up and move from an inside curve to a slight outside curve as I need to in order to pin it. Okay. I'm going to set my collar down. It will be easier to sew this if you were looking at your shirt. So if you'll put your collar down on your surface, and then you'll pin your shirt to the top of it, match center back. I have a little clip here in my collar for center back. Because my neckline is so clipped, I also stuck a pin in the clip that was center back so that I would know which clip was actually my center back and not just a clip to align the seams so that I can sew them. So I match center back up. Okay. I match my notch up. Now, if you look at the neck, there's a great big notch here. It's because this pattern actually is multi-sized for the collar band, and I just cut out all the different sizes as opposed to just the size that I need. You will get a much more accurate look if you truly just cut your notch. So I'm going to take time out, pull out the pattern, and actually cut the notch so that it matches up and you can see it. Okay, so I've gone back and cut just the notch from the collar band that I am using for this particular size. Match my notch. Match my notch. And the front of the shirt with that point. Now, the one thing that is going to be slightly different when we do our collar band than when we did our shirt, the cuff of the shirt. Remember, as we attached that cuff, we sewed from from the cuff side so that we could see that exact point and hit it. You can still do that if you will take the time to put several pins in. A lot of times when we clip something, we tell you to sew from the side that was clipped, because when you pull those clips, if you look at this, when I pull that clip, it tends to flip. And I don't want to catch that flipped edge in my seam. So if we sew it looking at that, we can see that and stop it from happening. I want to know where that spot is on the back, so I'm going to put enough pins in this that I can still sew it, or I have the choice now that I can sew it from the shirt side, looking at the clipped edges, because that's the side that's most likely to cause me trouble or to get a tuck, or I can try sewing it from the inside and actually hit that point. And remember, that point needs to be just like it was before, that thumbnail width just past the edge of the front there. So be sure you've got that, just that little thumbnail width. So I'll get this neckline all pinned in place, and then we will be ready to stitch it. If you look, you can see that these clips have opened up. The only way this collar will go on without tucks, without being very frustrating, is to have clipped that neckline first so the clips can open up and that inside curve again can change shape and match the outside curve of the collar band. So when it's smooth and lays there, then you're ready to sew it. Okay. Again, just like the cuff, you want to be sure when you sew it that you don't catch that seam. You want it to be out of the way, and you want to start exactly in that spot. So if you are going to sew from the inside or from the shirt side, it will make your life easier to go ahead from this back side here. I'm actually just going to stick a pin from that back side out. Okay. And now I know exactly where I have to drop my needle to start with. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. I'm going to find that exact spot that I ended. I'm going to drop a pin in it and come out to the outside so that I can see it. So I know I have to stop exactly at that spot. I need to stop and start where those two pins came through if I want to be able to sew from this shirt side, which is actually my easier side to sew from because my collar band will lay flat. It's my shirt that's going to tend to bunch. I don't want to get a tuck in my shirt. So if I mark those ends, I can still sew right to them. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew. Okay, so we're at the sewing machine. I want to drop my needle exactly where that pin is. And so I am going to look underneath my foot and literally drop that needle into place and then slide that pin out so that I'm exactly in that hole, and then drop my foot down. Again, this is choosing to sew from the shirt side. And it's a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Take some stitches, back stitch. And then I'm going to sew across this. And I don't want to catch that collar band facing. I only want to catch just the collar band. And sew it at 5/8 of an inch. And even as I'm sewing this, you can see those clips opening up as I lay that shirt and that inside neckline edge, that inside curve becoming an outside curve. Periodically look up underneath, make sure the collar band is out of the way, or the collar band facing is out of the way, and your collar band is laying flat. And then just continue sewing collar band to your shirt. Remember, when you sew an inside curve to an outside curve, the only place those seams are the same length and align and match up is right at 5/8. And so you will have rippling and bubbling going on out beyond 5/8, and you may have some stretching coming on between those clips inside 5/8. But you can just take your finger and run it right along where you're going to be sewing and make sure that it lays smooth at that point, and that will help to reduce the chance of you getting tucks as you are sewing. You just want to sew with a regulation stitch. Along the entire length of that collar band. Again, take the pins out as you get to them. Don't sew over your pins. The machine quite often makes kind of a funny stitch there. It's not quite straight, and you run the risk of actually hitting a pin. So take the pins out as you get there. Again, keep checking up underneath, make sure that that collar band stays out of the way. It's pulled out of the way, that you're not catching it. When you get to this other side, with your needle down, it may help you actually to lift your presser foot and kind of pull this around so that your seam can extend out and you can see that point. Remember that pin that I stuck in, and I know I have to sew right to that point. And then put the presser foot back down again and sew to exactly to that point. So as I get here, I'm actually going to hand wheel so I can watch the needle go in exactly where that pin is. Pop my pin out, hit my reverse button so that I go exactly to that point, and then cut your thread off. Perfect. All right, so after you've sewn it, then you will check along that seam, make sure that you don't have any tucks in your shirt. You can do that by just applying a teeny bit of pressure along that seam line. Just pull a little bit, look at your shirt, look at your collar band, make sure you do not have any tucks along that edge. You are also going to look and make sure that your collar band comes straight up from the button band on the shirt, making sure that it comes straight up from that button band edge and from the button edge. And you'll pull that, line it up, and make sure that it comes out straight, that you don't have an extension sticking out here. If it does, if your collar band extends out or stops too short and you have a tuck, you need to fix that before you go on. If you have no tucks and you align good at the front, we are now going to enclose that seam. Remember, with the shirt and with your sleeve and your cuff, we created a sandwich seam. We just folded that down and sandwiched it. We are going to create a burrito seam in order to do this, in order to line this up to have it get out of the way. So it will burrito easiest if you just take your shirt, because we're going to flat roll burrito rather than just roll it up, so that we get a flatter surface here inside of our button band. And so I'm going to take my shirt, that front end of my shirt, fold it into a third, fold it into a third, and then I'm going to take that now and just lay it, literally lay it, right on my collar band. And I sometimes like to pin that so that it stays in place and doesn't roll down. Okay. Then I'm going to bring my collar band facing around, and that will work a little bit easier if you do the same thing with your collar. I'm going to take that collar, fold it into a third, fold it into a third, and then as I bring that collar band facing around, lay that inside. And so this is a burrito seam because I've rolled that up. And what I'm doing is getting my shirt and my collar out of the way. Much like if you remember the cuff, we sandwich seamed the sleeve in there, and then we came back over our stitching and we sewed right on top of our stitching line just that inch to an inch and a half to make that corner a completely secured corner that would then allow us to come back and diagonally cut across it and trim it and grade it. And we're going to do that same thing here with the corner of our collar. So I have burritoed up the shirt, the front of the shirt, and I burritoed the collar itself, and now I'm pinning my collar band to my collar band facing right sides together with all of that wrapped up and rolled up inside of there. And I'm just going to sew from that exact spot again, right where I started before, that 5/8 inch terminated seam. I will start there back stitch, and I'm just going to sew for about an inch to an inch and a quarter. So we come back to the sewing machine and we'll get ready to do that. All right, so we are back in the sewing machine. I want to make sure that my needle goes right into that point. And so I come back, look underneath the foot here, and I drop that needle in exactly at that 5/8 inch terminated seam. Drop my presser foot, 2 to 3 stitches and back stitch. And I am just sewing that little corner area right on top of my stitching. I literally am sewing right on the same stitching line. So you want to be sewing looking at that interfacing so that you can see your stitching line. And you'll go an inch to an inch and a quarter, and then just back stitch and stop. And you're just sewing just that tip edge, and you will do that to both sides. You will do it to both sides of it. So when you sew your second side, if you will notice, on the opposite side I started at that point and sewed down in towards the collar band. As you sew your second side, in order to be able to look at that interface side, you will be starting in the collar band, and you are going to sew towards that point. This side was folded up the very same way. The seam had to be burritoed, the shirt itself had to be burritoed, and the collar itself burritoed, fold up inside of there. And then it was sewed, this time from the collar band to that point, and you terminate that seam exactly at that very same point that we have worked at from before. And then when both tips are done, it's going to be very much like your placket and your cuff were. You'll be able to reach up inside of here, pull out your shirt, pull out your collar, and that tip will be, that edge is completely enclosed, so that we can come back now and trim and grade and have that be completely enclosed and be able to get in there and trim closely. If you do it like your pattern guide said and just turn that edge up, this is all trimmed and graded, and you have to all sew this by hand with a needle and thread and try to catch a little teeny tiny trimmed and graded seam allowance. So that is why we have changed that area. So if you pull that out and you're happy with it, then we're going to start to trim and grade again now. So push it back out, just stick your finger back in there, pull the seams back out, and we'll be ready to trim and grade. All right, so here is the front edge, front corner of my collar band. I am going to trim across that front corner diagonally exactly like you did your cuff, and then swoop cut towards that edge to reduce all the bulk out of that corner. Now remember, I did pull it out and look at it and make sure I had nothing caught in there before I cut that, so that I wouldn't cut a hole in a collar band or a hole in my shirt. Okay? Then you are going to trim and grade the rest of your collar band just like you have before. If you'll trim that collar band right along that basting line, it'll leave your collar band seam at 3/8 of an inch. And so we'll trim across there. You'll go across the entire length of that collar band, clear to the other side. Then you are going to come back and trim your collar, the interfacing to the collar band, down to that 1/8 of an inch. And again, you can do that very simply by pulling the interfacing up. Just kind of lay your scissors on their side right against that interfacing so that you don't cut anything but the interfacing, and trim that interfacing to 1/8 of an inch. So the collar band gets trimmed to 3/8, the interfacing to 1/8. Now we have the shirt that is in there. And the shirt should be to 5/16, which means it should be just barely shorter than the collar band was. Or basically 5/16 is cutting that seam allowance exactly in half. You're going to trim that exactly into half. So we'll come back and trim that, the shirt itself, so that it is just barely shorter than the collar band was. So if you look at that, you can see there's my collar band, there's my shirt. It's just barely shorter. And you will continue that clear across the entire collar band along that neck. So the collar band itself, 3/8, interfacing 1/8. The shirt is 5/16. The seam allowance of the collar band facing has not been trimmed at all yet. We're going to wait on that. And so I will finish trimming and grading, and then we'll chat some more about what to do. So the neck edge is trimmed and graded. My collar band is 3/8. My interfacing is 1/8. My shirt is the 5/16. The collar band facing is still the total 5/8 of an inch there, because we're going to now pull this out. And you'll see that edge pulls out really pretty easily, and you can get a pretty good corner there if you trim that corner. If you pull that out and there's a little bit more fabric there than you want, it's a little bit bulky, just go ahead and turn it back inside out again. And you can do that by just sticking your finger up inside of there and shoving it back inside out. And the nice thing about this is it allows you to retrim that corner to get it as pointed or as sharp as you want to get it. Okay? Be cautious not to get too close that you actually wind up cutting a hole in there. But it will allow you to come back and get a little bit more fabric out. If when you pull that out it's not quite as sharp or as the bulk isn't quite as reduced as much as you want, you can get back in there and pull that out just a little bit. And then look from the right side, and it should come straight up from the band up into that curve and lay fairly smooth. So when you're happy with that, then the corner is ready to be is done. And where I pulled that one out and trimmed a little bit more, I'm just going to trim this one before I ever turn it, knowing that I wanted the other one trimmed a little bit more, so I'm going to come back and just give this guy a little bit more of a trim first. As you pull up, pull carefully, because you have made that seam allowance really narrow. And if your fabric frays, you run the risk of pulling through the seam. So as you pull it out, pull carefully. And that one lays smooth. Pleased with that. So I'm going to come back again to this ham. And I'm going to lay this ham, or lay my shirt over the ham, just like this shirt would head around my body here. I'm going to press this without a press cloth so that you can see what I'm doing. But for safety, it will be much better for you if you use a press cloth. I'm coming around the ham. I'm reaching up inside, making sure that seam is heading up towards my collar band. And I'm going to press that seam to define that seam's edge. And I can just reach up and grab my seam allowance. I'm just flip this so you can see. All I'm doing is reaching behind with my hand, grabbing my seam allowance, and making sure it's pulled up towards the collar band. And again, the reason I'm pressing from this side is so the curve that we favored into our collar band to have it roll around your shirt is heading around the ham in the same direction as we favored it to go. So reach up underneath, make sure that you have, let's go this way. The seam headed up there. And pressing that seam up towards the collar band. If you go over a hand the other direction, you are taking it and causing the curve to go the exact opposite direction to what we favored to do. So if you're going to use a ham, be sure you go from the right side with the press cloth. Got that edge defined. Okay, now more than anything, I want this collar band facing and the collar to be the same size so they lay smooth against each other. When it's all done, I do not want to have a tuck or a pucker or have it pull up or have a ripple in my collar band and have extra fabric. And so I've pressed this down, and I'm now going to take time to come back now and turn under my collar band so that the seam itself barely covers that folded edge, barely covers my seam allowance. And again, if I come from this direction and I've lined that up so it barely covers, the action of putting that pin in pulls that fabric just that little tiny bit over that edge and helps it to favor and cover the seam. Now remember, it hasn't been trimmed yet, and so when I pin this, I may not have as many pins in it as I would have when I sew it, because I'm going to actually press this, take all the pins out and trim it. But I may choose to put as many pins in so that I don't leave a gap and the collar band is allowed to pull or do something different than it would be if it were pinned in place here. Remember, your collar band was favored, and so it is slightly shorter from center front to center front. So just like you did with your cuff, you're going to have to do a little bit of stretching along that seam line edge, because we pulled out that and favored it so it would roll around your shirt, roll around your neck there. So it pulls easier though than your cuff did, because you are on a slight bias, you're on a little bit of a curve there. So your fabric has a little bit of give. So it will tend to pull just a little bit easier. So when you have that pinned all the way across and you're happy with it, it lays smooth, you're pinned in it, and you look at this, you follow along, you're barely covering the seam allowance all the way, flip it over, look at the right side, make sure that you're still smooth. When you're happy with that, then you will come back now, and yes, you have to press it from the inside edge. You can do this on a flat surface or in little tiny sections of the ham. And I've got to press that edge there. Okay. Because we have not yet trimmed that seam. Notice I'm trying to press between my pins, not on my pins, so that I don't press a pin indent into my fabric. And so I will press that in, then pull my pins, just like I did with the cuff. And now I've got an edge there that I will come back with my scissors now, and this seam allowance should be trimmed to 1/4 of an inch from that folded edge. And that allows, by pressing it under first, then going back and trimming it, It allows to make sure that you have enough fabric to barely cover that seam allowance and then have a 1/4 inch seam allowance left that will then lay down and finish the trimming and grading process for that shirt. So I will continue trimming across this and get it pinned in place and show you how to close it. So I had pressed under my collar band, taken all the pins out, trimmed it to a 1/4 inch, and now that pressed under seam is repinned in place, making sure that my folded edge barely covers my seam allowance. And if you'll notice how close my pins are together, you're going to want to have several pins in here, because just like the cuff, we are going to edge stitch this from the outside, hoping to completely catch that edge and close the hole on the inside. And if you don't have your pins close enough together, you run the risk of missing your fabric and winding up with places that you either have to restitch again or come back with a hand needle and stitch closed. If you're nervous about that, you certainly can slip stitch this open and closed if you choose to. Take a needle and thread and just do a slip stitch and close this with a needle and thread quickly. Then you would edge stitch from the right side, and you don't have to worry about catching that edge because you've already caught it with a slip stitch. But you can do it without slip stitching as long as you will pin carefully and then sew carefully. But if you want to slip stitch it, you certainly can. Once it's pinned into place, we are now ready to edge stitch the collar band. And even if you top stitched your collar, the collar band is completely edge stitched all the way around. It is edge stitched no matter what you have done to your collar band or to your cuffs or to your button band up the front. So we're going to go to the machine and edge stitch. When you edge stitch your collar band, you are going to start fairly near center back. It doesn't have to be exact, but get fairly close to the center back. Kind of find your two seams, get in the center of it, and you start at the top of your collar band, or where the collar band has been attached to the collar. And we'll start at that point. And we're going to stitch completely all the way around this collar band. Your top edge is completely enclosed already. If it helps you when you're edge stitching, you're welcome to use a number 5 foot or number 10 foot to stitch around this. Remember, edge stitching by definition is 1/8 of an inch or less from the edge. And you sew it from the right side. You sew it from the face of the garment because it does show on the face of the garment. You noticed when I started I did not backstitch. Because we are on the face of the garment, we will not be backstitching. When you get to your curve, to place your fingers out to the side kind of as a pivot point, you can edge stitch around that curve, keeping your stitching parallel to the edge. Pivot turn at the bottom corner. This corner is completely enclosed as well, because we burrito seamed that so it would turn out like the David Coffin method. And now as you sew, your shirt is going to be pushed through the sewing machine here in this armband as you come around this bottom side. You'll reach up underneath and take those pins out just before you get to them. And I will quite often stick my fingertip on a pin so that I know that next pin is just at the toe of the presser foot, and go ahead and pull that out. And then I come down and find my next pin, and I know the next pin is at the toe of the presser foot, and I can reach up underneath and take that out. Remember, those pins are placed, I placed my pins fairly close together so that the back side of this would be caught as we sew. That I would catch that collar band facing. Not sure why we have that thread that's cut there, but we are going to sure you go slow enough that you're able to stay straight. Use your fingers, feel and make sure that there's not a tuck. You don't have fabric tucked up underneath there. Again, I've got my finger where the next pin is, so I know when to reach up and take the pin out. And every time I reach up in there, I make sure that you've noticed that I'm making sure I pulled that shirt back out of the way again so I don't catch my shirt as I'm coming around here. As you get towards the front, sometimes it's easier just to go ahead and pull the shirt so the majority of it's now behind your machine. Keep just enough there. Notice as I'm sewing, I also will quite often hold my hands, which allows me to pull on my seam allowance just a little bit and keep that defined so I don't wind up with a little bubble along my seam allowance as I'm edge stitching it into place. And I continue to the front of the garment here. Pivot turn. And head up around that curve. And then along the collar band, back till you reach your stitching. So as you head around the top of the collar again, you're just going to continue to sew until you come back to where you began. And when you get back to where you began, you'll just stitch over the top of those stitches for about 3 or 4 stitches. That way your first stitching does not need a knot. These 3 or 4 stitches will embed it. And then you'll tie a knot in the end of that when you're through. Then you'll flip it over, look at it. Ideally, all along this edge here, it should be caught, and it should be fairly close to looking like an edge stitching and not have any tucks in it, which is what we've got, and that is good. So that the collar band facing is completely enclosed. If you look at the outside, our edge stitching is an even width all the way around without wobbles. Our collar folds down and rolls, and then your collar band will lay smooth as long as it's got a curve to it. If you pull it out straight, it's going to tend to be a little bit ripply, which is what we want. We want it to want to stay curved. And when you have that, your collar band is done and you are complete. The only thing you have to do is pull your thread through and tie your knot on the back there, and then you are done. Okay.